Hey guys, Brian here. Thanks for joining me. Today we've got a great video that I hope you're going to find interesting, all about Crested Gecko genetics. Now, Crested Gecko genetics, when it comes to breeding reptiles, breeding crested geckos, and trying to breed for certain morphs or patterns, Crested Gecko genetics are very complicated, and it's made vastly more complicated due to the amount of misinformation and misunderstanding that's out there about them. If you guys watched one of our previous videos, 10 misconceptions about crested geckos, one of those misconceptions I listed was that crested geckos are polymorphic. I put that as a misconception. In that video, just due to time constraints, I didn't really have time to get really deep into it and explain everything as good as I wanted to. So I'm going to make this video where we're really going to dig into that. I'm going to tell you why that statement is correct and why it's incorrect. And we're really going to dig into Crested Gecko genetics and learn everything there is to know about them. So thanks for joining me today. Let's get right into it. Now, as I said before, in a previous video, I made the statement that crested geckos are not polymorphic. Now, that statement is both true and false. Now, using the scientific definition of polymorphic, that statement is true. Crested geckos are polymorphic. But, without exception, in the gecko world, the term polymorphic is used incorrectly. Let me show you what I mean. Now, the scientific definition of polymorphism or polymorphic is: polymorphism in biology and zoology is the occurrence of two or more clearly different morphs or forms, also referred to as alternative phenotypes, in the population of a species. In order to be classified as such, morphs must occupy the same habitat in the same time and belong to a panmictic population, one with random breeding. So that basically means polymorphic is any species when within a wild population there is one or more clearly different morph. Now, mostly in nature, the way evolution works is whichever genetic mutation best favors the survival of a species, that's the one that survives, and all the animals look the same, or they all have the same adaptations. Most animals we see all look the same, barring sexual dimorphism, which is males and females that have different appearances. Most animals, they all look exactly the same. Polymorphic means that the same species, animals, can look vastly different because they've evolved two separate visual variations that both survive and breed at the same time. Now, in the gecko world, the word polymorphic is used completely differently. When it comes to crested geckos, whenever you hear somebody say polymorphic, what they mean is the idea that variations in physical appearance is largely random and Mendelian genetics do not apply or control how different traits or morphs are inherited. That is completely false. For one, that's not what polymorphic means, and for two, that is not true about crested geckos. So this is where it gets really confusing. By the scientific definition of polymorphism, crested geckos are polymorphic. But whenever you hear somebody say that, they're not using the scientific definition. Like I said, without exception, I've never come across a case where somebody means the actual meaning. They always mean this made-up crested gecko meaning that basically means crested gecko morphs and traits don't follow Mendelian genetics, which is completely false. I don't know why this myth has gotten so much traction, but it's not true, and it is so widely believed that people don't even question it. Now, I made some notes. To give you a couple quick examples of polymorphism that occur naturally that we all know about, one is jaguars in South and Central America. We've all seen black panthers or melanistic jaguars. There is no distinct advantage to either being or not being melanistic when it comes to a jaguar, so normal and melanistic populations can live and interbreed side by side. There's no survival advantage to either being or not being melanistic. So they're polymorphic. Either or can survive and breed together, and they both exist. Other versions of polymorphism, humans, eye color. Eye color is genetically inherited from your parents, but there's no distinct advantage to blue eyes versus green eyes versus brown eyes. That's why they all coexist together. If there were some magical advantage to having blue eyes, say just for example, if blue-eyed people didn't get heart disease, blue-eyed people would live longer, they would reproduce more, and that's the way evolution works. Eventually, due to natural selection, everybody would have blue eyes. That's how evolution works. Polymorphism is when there is no advantage and multiple forms can live side by side and evolve at the same time. Like I said, geckos, technically, crested geckos are polymorphic, but that's not what people mean when they say it. Now, the other part of this that makes it so confusing is people, like I said, don't believe crested gecko morphs follow Mendelian genetics. They absolutely do. Real quick, Mendelian genetics, or Mendel's law, is the manner by which genes and traits are passed from parents to their offspring. I'm not going to get real deep into how this works. I'll put some links in the description if you guys are interested in learning more about this. Most of us learned about this in biology class in high school, and most of us don't remember any of it. I know I certainly didn't when I first started getting into this. But if you remember, it's the example they always use in high school is the green peas versus the yellow peas, and how yellow peas are recessive. So if you breed them together, you can use the square to mathematically figure out how many green and yellow peas you're going to get from a breeding. That's the basic idea. Like I said, I'm not going to get deep into it, but if you want to learn more, check out the link in the description. So people don't think they apply. The reason people don't think this applies to crested geckos is fairly confusing. For one, the term polymorphic, like I said, got twisted into a different meaning, an incorrect meaning, and people now believe that is absolutely true when it's not. And for two, without there being one single wild type, when you breed geckos, there's not one single wild type. So normally, I'll use ball pythons for example. If you take a normal or wild ball python and you breed it to a pastel, a simple codominant trait, it's very easy to track how that trait breeds, what the offspring are, and you can figure out any new trait that comes up in ball pythons. You can figure out exactly what it is and how it works by breeding it to a normal. We don't have normals in crested geckos. We don't even know, when you pick any random gecko, you don't know how many different traits and mutations that gecko has, whether it's showing them or if it's recessive and it's not showing them, but the genes are there. You just don't know, and there's really no good way to figure it out. So it became, by default, the default answer was just, oh, well, they're polymorphic and it's all random, so you know, just breed two geckos together and you can kind of make educated guesses what you think might pop out, but nobody really knows for sure. That's completely false. You don't always know for sure what's going to get out, only because you don't know what genes and what mutations your geckos have, because they're so mixed up and mishmashed that it makes it really hard. They're mixed up and mishmashed because they are polymorphic. They've evolved so many different variations that so many different geckos can have so many different genes that it's hard to tell. But the fact that they are in fact polymorphic doesn't mean that Mendelian genetics don't apply and you can't still figure out how the breeding works. So like I said, it's extremely complicated. It's made vastly more complicated by the amount of misinformation that's out there and is constantly regurgitated and repeated. And that's just, people just take that what they hear as fact and they assume that's true and repeat it to other people, and it spreads, and now that's just what people assume is true, but it's not. So to get more into this, there are several known morphs that we know exactly what they are, what type of morph they are, and how they reproduce. There are several that we think we know what they are, we can make a good guess, and there's evidence for, and then there's ones that we have no idea what's going on or why it works. That doesn't mean there isn't a structured reason why it's doing that. It just means we don't know what it is. Let me give you some examples. The first up is the axanthic morph. The axanthic morph has been tested through breeding and proven out as a simple recessive trait. Again, I'm not going to get real deep into what the different types of inheritance are. If you want that information, check out the link below. But it's been proven out it's a simple recessive trait. Some people flat out refuse to believe this simply because they don't believe Mendelian genetics control crested gecko morphs, but they absolutely do. And this is a clear example of a recessive trait. The next one is the lily white morph. The lily white morph is an incomplete dominant morph, which is basically a recessive trait, but instead of being a non-visual het where the hets don't look different from a normal, the het is visual, and then there's a super form when you breed two together. So the het form of a lily white looks like this. They've just got a ton of white pattern all over them. Gorgeous animals, by the way. The super form is a fatal leucistic. They don't survive. They're leucistic. They have no pigment whatsoever, but unfortunately it's a fatal gene. This is very similar to if you research jaguar carpet pythons. Jaguar carpet pythons have reduced amounts of melanin. It's an incomplete dominant mutation. The simple form has reduced melanin, so they're high yellow, reduced pattern, and the super form is a leucistic animal that's not viable. They don't survive. It's the same exact thing. It's a clearly defined, easily tracked, incomplete dominant morph. Very simple, and yet still some people refuse to believe it simply because they've been programmed to say crested geckos are polymorphic. They don't follow Mendelian genetics, so obviously the people behind lily whites are lying. They say the same thing about the xanthics. They're made up. It's just ridiculous that people still believe this. Another example is Dalmatians. Dalmatians are an incomplete dominant morph. There's Dalmatians and super Dalmatians. Now Dalmatians get kind of confusing because you can't always tell just by looking at them if it's the super form or not. The common misconception behind these is that a lot of people will say a gecko needs 25 spots to qualify as a Dalmatian and 100 spots to qualify as a super Dalmatian, and that's completely wrong. That is akin to if you went to a ball python breeder and found a low white piebald ball python. It was just a piebald that just had a little white on it, maybe near the tail, and the rest was normal colored. It's not a high white like the ones that you see are mostly white, just a low white pied. And you told that breeder, that pied ball python isn't really pied enough to really be a pied. That's a ridiculous statement. The amount of white on it has nothing to do with the fact that it is genetically a piebald ball python. Same thing. The amount of spots on a gecko doesn't make it not genetically a Dalmatian. If it has a single Dalmatian spot, it is a Dalmatian. It has that gene. If it didn't have that gene, it wouldn't have spots. Another one that is so commonly repeated, and it's so frustrating because it's so simple and people just refuse to believe it because it's not what you hear on Facebook or somewhere when you ask. It's not what's commonly repeated. Those are the ones that I know for sure what the morphs are. That's a short list of ones that it's absolutely clear what they are and how they work. These ones are speculated. Harlequins. I believe Harlequins they're either dominant or codominant or incomplete dominant. Codominant and incomplete dominant are technically different, but in the reptile world, they're used interchangeably. It's another one that makes everything even more confusing, but we don't know for sure if the Harlequin trait is codominant or incomplete dominant with a super form, or if it's simply dominant and there's a wide range of different expressions. So this, if it is incomplete dominant, the super form obviously is going to have a lot more pattern. And the simple form is going to be a low pattern, like this animal, not much pattern, and the super form would be high pattern animals like this. Or it's simply a dominant trait. They're all genetically the same, and some of them just have a higher expression and more pattern than others do. Not all Harlequins look the same, just like not all piebald ball pythons look exactly the same. Some are low white, some are high white, but they're exactly the same genetically. So we're not sure about Harlequins yet, but they're one of the two. That's pretty clear. Another example is the phantom pinstripe. Now the phantom gene, basically the phantom gene mutes out all the Harlequin markings on a gecko. So you can actually see on this guy all the pattern on his sides, his whole back. You can see where the cream should be if the phantom gene wasn't muting it out. The phantom gene just mutes out all that cream from the Harlequin pattern. And we're pretty sure the phantom gene is actually a recessive trait, but we're not totally sure. The reason we think it's recessive is you can breed two normal pinstripes together and get phantom pinstripes. You see this most often with red pinstripes. You breed two red pinstripes and you get patternless red animals. That's the phantom gene muting out all that color, and we think it's recessive because you can get it from two animals that neither of them show the phantom gene. Another one that we have, this one is our charcoal line. So our charcoal morph is a form of melanistic, just like the black panthers, melanistic jaguars we talked about earlier. I don't know, I know this is not recessive because I've gotten charcoals breeding a charcoal animal to a non-charcoal animal, one that doesn't have the gene. If this one doesn't have the gene and it was recessive, you could not get visual offspring. We have gotten visual offspring from that pairing, so we know it's not a recessive trait. It's either dominant or codominant. We don't yet know if there's a super form. This season I am breeding two visual charcoals together to see if anything else happens. When you breed two together, if there is a super form, it will express itself. So this year we will find out if this is simply a dominant gene or a codominant gene with a super form. But it's clearly inheritable. It clearly follows Mendelian genetic guidelines and rules. Another one that people just say doesn't exist, but they absolutely do. They absolutely follow the rules, just like every other crested gecko morph. The last one that we speculate on is color. This one is a black or lavender type. These ones are the ones that fire down light gray, almost purplish, and then they fire up black. I think this color is actually a recessive trait. The reason I think that, again, is if you breed two red pinstripes together, you can get black or lavender type offspring. Black lavender pinstripe offspring. Obviously, if both the parents are visually red, but they both carry that recessive trait, you can get black offspring. It fits the rules to be a recessive trait. I'm not confident. I just haven't done the testing to say definitively yes it is, but I do believe it's a recessive trait. Like I said, crested gecko morphs are complicated, but that doesn't mean we can't figure this stuff out. Using breeding, tracking your breedings, and keeping records. It's not that hard to do. The problem is most people refuse to believe it. There's ample evidence to prove crested geckos do follow Mendelian genetics, and people just refuse to believe it. It's ridiculous. So I hope this gives you some examples of things that we know follow these genetic rules. The next one I want to show you is the solid red. So this would be a red phantom. Again, you can see on the back where the cream color would be if it wasn't a phantom. Now, there are things that we don't know why they work the way they work. Why, when you produce certain things, we don't know why it happens or how it happens. And that's simply because we just don't know what genes are working in all of these animals. There could be things that aren't visual that are affecting how other things are expressed. That's what makes crested geckos so complicated. So there are still things we don't know. Just because we don't know them doesn't mean Mendelian genetics don't apply. It just means we don't know yet. One example is if you breed two red pinstripes together, you can get red pinstripe offspring, red patternless offspring, which would be the phantom gene muting out all the color like this one, or you can get black and cream black pinstripe offspring. Now, if the phantom gene is recessive and the black color, the black lavender color is recessive, in theory it should be possible to get a black lavender phantom pinstripe would be a double recessive. The odds are long to get one, but you would eventually get one breeding two red pinstripes that also produce black. So let me explain it a little better. If you had two red pinstripes and you know this pair produces both patternless reds and black and cream pinstripes, they've got the phantom gene and they've got the black lavender gene. They should be able to produce an animal with both those genes, which would be a patternless black or lavender phantom pinstripe. The problem is that never happens. I've never once ever seen two red pinstripes produce a patternless black lavender colored animal. We don't know why. That doesn't mean that the phantom gene isn't recessive, and that doesn't mean that the black lavender color isn't recessive. It just means we don't know why that happens. There's something else that's affecting it, or for some reason those two genes don't interact together, so when those two are both expressed, they express a different visual look altogether. We just don't know. That's one of the things that we haven't figured out yet. That's one of the things that makes crested geckos most confusing, and examples like that are why people frankly take the lazy road, and instead of trying to do the work to figure out why that happens, they just say, well, they're polymorphic, so, stuff like that happens. You breed two together, you never know what you're going to get. It's like a grab bag. That's just a cop-out. It's an easy answer. For most people, it's not a cop-out. It's just what they believe because it's what they've been programmed to believe. But that's not true. They follow Mendelian genetics, so if you're breeding crested geckos, track your lineage. Track what morphs you're working with. Track what traits you know your breeders have. Keep notes on what you think they have, and try and figure some of this stuff out. It's not that hard. It just takes some work. There's a lot of breeders that are doing this. A lot of the full-time bigger breeders, guys that make their living doing this, do track all this stuff. They know these work with Mendelian genetics, and that's how they produce a lot of the things they do. A lot of the smaller breeders don't believe that, and they don't do the work. They just go with the knowledge that they were given and they're programmed with, and that's not helping us figure anything out. So that is pretty much that. That's a quick rundown, not that quick, but that's a rundown on basically how crested gecko genetics work, what the misconceptions are, why the popular belief about these guys is wrong, and hopefully I've given examples to prove why they're wrong and show you guys that these do follow Mendelian genetics. They're not a complete grab bag. It's not breed two together and anything can come out. That's just not how it works. It just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of effort to track your lines and try and figure out exactly what's going on. So hopefully in the future we will get more and more information on this. We will figure more and more things out. Maybe some way far down the road we'll be able to figure this out to the point where you can know with a high degree of certainty what you're going to produce on any pairing at any time. But like I said, there's so many geckos out there that are so mixed up with who knows how many different traits that it's really, really hard. So I think I'm going to stop it there. Hopefully that made sense to a lot of you and this kind of clears some things up. I'm really hoping people that watch this will start to come around to this way of thinking, because if everybody starts thinking this way and starts breeding their geckos this way, it gets easier for everybody. If the majority of people just keep saying, well, you know, they're polymorphic, so just breed two together and you never know what you're going to get, that only makes a problem worse. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and I hope you're not sitting there shaking your head going, this guy's out of his mind. I appreciate you guys watching. If you want to see more videos, please subscribe to our channel. Check the description down below. Check the description down below for more links to more information. And if you have any comments about any of this, don't hesitate to leave me a comment down below, and I will get back to all you guys. I love discussing this. I'm down for discussing any questions you guys have. I love talking about this, so please leave me comments down below. Let's talk about it more. Thank you guys for watching. Have a wonderful day.